At the heart of the Syrian Desert, where the land stretches flat and unforgiving beneath a relentless sun, there once stood a city that seemed to defy geography, time, and even empire itself. Palmyra rose not because the desert was kind, but because human ambition was relentless. Long before the modern world learned its name, through images of explosions and ruins, Palmyra was already ancient, already layered with memory, already shaped by the rise and fall of civilizations that believed themselves eternal. Its story is not merely one of stone and columns, but of power, trade, faith, and ultimately, destruction, a quiet warning carved into the desert itself. Palmyra did not begin as a grand city. It emerged first as an oasis, a fragile point of life between the Mediterranean world and Mesopotamia, where water made survival possible and movement inevitable. For centuries, caravans crossed these sands carrying silk, spices, incense, precious metals, and ideas. Palmyra became the meeting point not of armies at first, but of merchants, languages, and beliefs. Aramaic was spoken alongside Greek and Latin. Eastern gods stood beside Roman deities. Architecture blended influences that should never have met, yet somehow formed a coherent whole. Palmyra was not isolated. It was connected to everything. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Palmyra had transformed into a city of astonishing confidence. Monumental colonnades stretched across the desert floor like stone rivers. Temples rose with mathematical precision, yet bore decorative details borrowed from distant cultures. Funerary towers pierced the horizon, built not only to honor the dead, but to proclaim status, lineage, and permanence. This was architecture as identity stone, declaring who the Palmyrans believed themselves to be. The Roman Empire eventually recognized what the desert had already revealed. Palmyra was too valuable to ignore. Rome did not conquer it immediately through brute force. Instead, Palmyra was absorbed gradually, granted privileges, autonomy, and protection in exchange for loyalty and stability. This relationship allowed the city to flourish. Trade expanded. Wealth accumulated. Local elites adopted Roman customs without abandoning their own traditions. The city became a rare example of cultural negotiation rather than erasure, a place where empire ruled through partnership instead of annihilation. Yet prosperity carries its own dangers. As Palmyra grew richer, it also grew more visible, more strategic, and more vulnerable. Power invites attention, and attention invites conflict. The city's location, once its greatest strength, became a liability as empires clashed over control of eastern trade routes. Rome relied on Palmyra as a buffer against rival powers, but buffers are often the first to be crushed. The tension between autonomy and obedience reached its breaking point in the 3rd century. In a time when the Roman world itself was fracturing under internal instability, Palmyra briefly stepped into the vacuum of power. Under bold leadership, the city asserted dominance over vast territories, challenging Rome's authority and redefining itself, not as a client, but as a rival. For a moment, Palmyra stood at the center of an empire of its own making, daring to imagine a future independent of Rome. That moment did not last. Rome responded as empires always do, when challenged decisively and violently. The reconquest was swift, and the punishment severe. Palmyra was sacked. Its political ambitions were crushed. Much of its wealth vanished. The city survived, but it was wounded. What followed was not immediate abandonment, but a long, quiet decline. Trade routes shifted. Empires reorganized. The desert reclaimed what human ambition could no longer sustain. Over centuries, Palmyra faded from living memory and entered the realm of ruins. Its columns still stood, its temples still cast shadows, but the city no longer spoke with the voice of power. Instead, it became a relic admired, studied, romanticized. Travelers from distant lands described it as a ghost of classical greatness frozen in sand. Archaeologists measured, cataloged, and attempted to reconstruct its past, treating the city as a completed story, rather than a vulnerable one. This illusion of safety that ruins are immune to further harm would prove tragically false. In the modern era, Palmyra became a symbol of shared human heritage. It was protected by law, recognized internationally, and presented as evidence that ancient civilizations belonged not to one nation, but to humanity as a whole. Yet legal protection cannot stop ideology, and stone cannot defend itself. When war returned to the Syrian desert, it did not arrive as a distant echo of history. It arrived with explosives, cameras, and a deliberate intent to erase. The destruction of Palmyra in the 21st century was not collateral damage. It was calculated. Temples that had survived earthquakes, invasions, and centuries of neglect were reduced to rubble in moments. Sculptures were smashed, looted, or sold. What could not be sold was destroyed. The goal was not only physical annihilation, but symbolic domination, an attempt to rewrite history by obliterating its most visible witnesses. In those moments, the world watched as Palmyra was attacked, not as a city, but as an idea. An idea that cultures can coexist. An idea that architecture can carry memory across millennia. An idea that history, once made, cannot be undone. The ruins fell, but the meaning of their destruction spread far beyond the desert. Palmyra's tragedy forces a deeper question, not only about war, but about how fragile cultural memory truly is. If monuments that survived nearly 2,000 years can vanish in seconds, what does that say about the permanence we assign to stone, to legacy, to civilization itself? Perhaps Palmyra was never meant to be eternal. Perhaps its true legacy lies not in what was built, but in what its loss reveals about us. This is where the story truly begins, not with ruins, but with responsibility. Responsibility to remember accurately, to understand deeply, and to confront the uncomfortable truth that history does not end when the stones stop standing. To understand why Palmyra mattered so deeply, and why its destruction resonated far beyond Syria, one must slow down and look closely at what the city actually was. Not as a ruin photographed from above, not as a headline reduced to before and after images, but as a living urban organism shaped by deliberate choices. Palmyra was not accidental. Every street, every column, every temple was a negotiation between geography, belief, and power. Unlike cities anchored by rivers or coastlines, Palmyra existed because humans forced it to exist. Water was scarce, agriculture limited, and the desert unforgiving. What sustained the city was movement. Caravans did not simply pass through Palmyra, they depended on it. The city offered protection, storage, taxation systems, and legal mediation for merchants traveling between the Roman Mediterranean and the empires of the East. This made Palmyra wealthy, but it also made it cosmopolitan in a way few ancient cities ever were. That cosmopolitan identity became visible in stone. The Great Colonnade, stretching for more than a kilometer, was not merely decorative. It was a statement of order imposed upon chaos, a ceremonial spine that organized civic life. Its columns followed Greco-Roman proportions, yet their capitals and decorative motifs subtly departed from classical norms. This was not imitation. It was adaptation. Palmyra absorbed architectural language and rewrote it in its own dialect. The temples told a similar story. The Temple of Bel was not simply a Roman temple placed in the desert. Its layout reflected Near Eastern religious traditions, with an enclosed courtyard and ritual spaces that differed sharply from Roman norms. Yet its facade spoke the language of empire symmetry, monumental scale, and classical ornamentation. Worshippers did not experience this architecture as contradictory. For them, it was natural. Palmyra's identity was hybrid by design. Even death was architectural. The funerary towers that lined the Valley of the Tombs were vertical cities of memory, housing generations of the same family. These structures blended Roman portraiture with Eastern burial customs, placing individualized sculpted faces within a collective ancestral space. Death in Palmyra was not hidden. It was monumentalized, displayed, and woven into the urban fabric. Architecture ensured that the past remained physically present. This architectural confidence reflected political reality. Palmyra governed itself through a powerful merchant elite, whose wealth came from trade, not conquest. These elites funded public buildings, religious monuments, and infrastructure, reinforcing a civic culture rooted in prosperity and stability. Rome tolerated, even encouraged this arrangement because it worked. Palmyra kept the desert routes open, supplied goods, and prevented rival powers from gaining a foothold. But stability is never permanent. As Rome entered a period of crisis in the 3rd century, the balance shifted. Military threats increased along the eastern frontier. Trade became more dangerous. Authority weakened. In this environment, Palmyra's elites were forced to think differently. Protection could no longer be outsourced to a distant empire struggling to govern itself. Security demanded action. Palmyra's rise from partner to power was not driven by ideology, but by necessity. Control of territory meant control of trade routes. Control of trade routes meant survival. What began as regional defense expanded rapidly, fueled by wealth, military organization, and political ambition. For a brief moment, Palmyra transformed from intermediary to imperial center. Its architecture, once symbolic, now became political propaganda, visible proof of authority, extending far beyond the oasis. Yet empires built on opportunity, rather than structure, rarely endure. Rome could forgive autonomy, but not competition. Once Palmyra crossed the invisible line from ally to rival, its fate was sealed. The retaliation that followed was not only military. It was psychological. The destruction of parts of the city served as a warning, not just to Palmyra, but to any province that might imagine independence. After the reconquest, Palmyra was never fully destroyed, but it was never trusted again. Trade privileges vanished. Political autonomy was stripped away. The city remained inhabited, but diminished a shadow of its former self. Architecture that once announced confidence now stood as a reminder of failure. Over time, the desert resumed its quiet work, eroding relevance as surely as it eroded stone. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erasure. New empires rose and fell. Religious landscapes shifted. Palmyra adapted, but always on a smaller scale. By the time medieval travelers encountered its ruins, the city was already a memory layered atop other memories. Its original purpose long forgotten. What remained was spectacle columns rising from sand, detached from the lives that created them. This transformation from living city to romantic ruin created a dangerous illusion that Palmyra was finished, complete, untouchable. That its story was safely locked in the past. Archaeology reinforced this idea, freezing the city at a particular moment in time, isolating it from the violence of the present. Palmyra became something to admire, not something to protect. And so, When modern war returned to the desert, Palmyra stood exposed not only physically, but conceptually. It was known, visible, symbolically charged. The very qualities that once made it powerful, now made it a target. The tragedy of Palmyra is not that it was ancient, nor that it was beautiful, nor even that it was destroyed. The tragedy is that it was misunderstood, treated as a relic instead of a responsibility, as an artifact instead of a warning. Because Palmyra had already taught this lesson once before, that power invites violence, that architecture carries meaning far beyond stone, and that civilizations do not disappear. When their buildings fall, they disappear. When memory fails. When Palmyra re-entered global consciousness in the modern era, it did so under a new identity, not as a living city, but as heritage. Scholars, archaeologists, and cultural institutions framed Palmyra as a masterpiece of antiquity, a rare fusion of East and West preserved by time and sand. This framing carried admiration, but it also carried distance. The city was no longer understood as something fragile and ongoing, but as something completed, stabilized, and safely confined to the past. Systematic archaeological work began in earnest in the 19th and 20th centuries, driven largely by European expeditions. These missions documented Palmyra with precision, measuring columns, mapping streets, cataloging inscriptions, and reconstructing fragments of its history through stone. The work was invaluable. Without it, much of what we know about Palmyra would be lost. Yet archaeology also imposed a narrative freeze. Palmyra was presented as a classical ruin, detached from the modern world that surrounded it. This separation had consequences. The ruins became a destination, a symbol, an academic reference point, but not a lived space with contemporary vulnerability. Tourism grew. Palmyra appeared in textbooks, museum exhibitions, and travel photography. It was listed as a protected cultural site, safeguarded by international conventions and symbolic declarations. Protection, however, existed largely on paper. It assumed stability. It assumed rational actors. It assumed that the past would be respected simply because it was ancient. Meanwhile, the region around Palmyra was changing. Political pressures accumulated. Economic inequality deepened. State authority weakened. Cultural heritage existed within a landscape of unresolved conflict. Yet the ruins themselves were still imagined as neutral, as if history could remain untouched while the present burned. This assumption would soon prove catastrophic. When armed conflict engulfed Syria in the early 21st century, Palmyra's isolation became a liability. The desert that once protected it now left it exposed. There were no dense urban populations to shield it. No immediate strategic value to discourage attack. No living community empowered to defend it. What remained was symbolism, and symbolism is powerful fuel for ideological violence. The assault on Palmyra was not spontaneous. It was staged, documented, and broadcast. The destruction followed a logic that had nothing to do with military necessity. Ancient temples were rigged with explosives. Sculptures were smashed deliberately. Burial towers were targeted. What could be looted was removed and sold into illicit markets. What could not be monetized was annihilated. This was not collateral damage. It was performance. By destroying Palmyra, the attackers were not simply erasing stone. They were attacking the idea that history belongs to everyone. They understood that architecture carries authority, that monuments legitimize memory, and that obliterating them is a way of asserting dominance over time itself. In this sense, Palmyra was not chosen randomly. It was chosen because it mattered. The global response was swift, but largely symbolic. Condemnations were issued. Emergency meetings were held. Digital reconstructions were proposed. Pledges were made to rebuild. Yet none of these gestures could reverse what had already happened. A temple rebuilt is not the same temple. A scanned ruin is not a lived city. What was lost in Palmyra was not just material authenticity, but continuity, the unbroken physical presence of history. This moment exposed a harsh truth about cultural preservation in the modern world. International recognition does not equal protection. Legal frameworks do not stop explosives. Documentation does not replace responsibility. The systems designed to safeguard heritage were built for peacetime, not for ideological war. Palmyra revealed that heritage, once weaponized, becomes defenseless. Yet the destruction also forced a reckoning. Scholars began to question long-held assumptions about neutrality and detachment. Museums confronted the ethics of ownership and representation. Governments faced uncomfortable questions about selective outrage, about which histories are mourned loudly and which vanish quietly. Palmyra became a mirror reflecting global priorities, and the image was not flattering. In the aftermath, discussions of reconstruction emerged almost immediately. Should Palmyra be rebuilt? Should its temples rise again from fragments and digital models? Or should the ruins remain as scars, evidence of violence, rather than simulations of restoration? There were no easy answers. Rebuilding risked falsifying history. Leaving the ruins untouched risked surrendering memory to destruction. Palmyra resisted resolution, just as it always had. Perhaps this resistance is the point. Palmyra's story cannot be neatly concluded because it is not only about the past. It is about how modern societies relate to history, whether they treat it as decoration, as data, or as obligation. The ruins force a choice to see heritage as static and disposable, or as something bound to human responsibility across generations. What remains of Palmyra today is fractured, incomplete, and silent. Yet silence does not mean absence. The city still speaks through gaps, through loss, through the questions it leaves behind. It asks whether civilization is measured by what it builds, or by what it refuses to destroy. It asks whether memory can survive violence, and whether the world is willing to protect what it claims to value. Palmyra has already endured empires, conquest, neglect, and time. Its latest destruction may be its most revealing chapter. Not because it shows what was lost, but because it exposes who we are when history is placed in our hands. In the years following the destruction, Palmyra entered a new and uncertain phase, one defined not by empires or trade, but by debate. The question was no longer how the city once functioned, but what it should now become. Around the world, scholars, architects, historians, and policymakers argued over the same dilemma that has haunted cultural heritage for generations. Whether rebuilding restores dignity, or whether it risks erasing the truth of loss. Reconstruction has always carried symbolic weight. To rebuild is to assert continuity, to claim that violence has failed to sever the thread of history. Yet Palmyra complicates this impulse. The city was not damaged by time or accident. It was destroyed intentionally, with full awareness of its meaning. To rebuild exactly what was lost risks transforming destruction into a temporary inconvenience rather than a historical rupture. A reconstructed temple may resemble the original, but resemblance is not equivalence. Stone cut in the 21st century does not carry the same memory as stone shaped nearly 2,000 years earlier. At the same time, leaving Palmyra in fragments feels like surrender. Ruins left untouched can harden into monuments of defeat, silently affirming that violence has the final word. for the local population, whose lives were disrupted long before the world noticed the ruins falling, the question is even more complex. Heritage does not exist in abstraction. It exists within lived landscapes, economies, and identities. A site frozen as a scar may serve global memory, but it may not serve those who live alongside it. These tensions reveal an uncomfortable truth. Global heritage discourse often speaks over local reality. Decisions about Palmyra's future are debated in conference halls far from the desert, shaped by institutions with moral authority but limited accountability. The city becomes a symbol again. This time not of ancient trade or imperial ambition, but of international values and unresolved guilt. Palmyra is asked to carry meanings imposed from outside, just as it was during the Roman era. Yet history suggests that Palmyra has always existed in this space of projection. It has been a mirror for those who encountered it. Merchants saw opportunity. Empires saw strategy. Travelers saw romance. Archaeologists saw data. Extremists saw provocation. Each group interpreted the city through its own needs. The ruins themselves never chose these roles. They endured them. What makes the modern moment distinct is speed. Destruction unfolded in days. Images spread in seconds. Outrage surged and faded in cycles, measured by news attention rather than historical consequence. Palmyra became viral, then peripheral. This acceleration stands in stark contrast to the slow rhythms that once defined the city: the measured pace of caravans, the gradual layering of architecture, the centuries-long negotiation between cultures. Modernity compressed tragedy into spectacle. In this compression, something essential was lost: time for understanding. The destruction of Palmyra was often framed as an isolated atrocity, detached from broader patterns of heritage loss across conflict zones. In reality, it was part of a continuum. Libraries burned, museums looted, shrines demolished, archives erased. Palmyra stood out only because it was already famous. Countless other sites vanished without international names or camera crews. This selective visibility forces a reckoning. If heritage is protected only when it is recognizable to a global audience, then protection is not universal, it is conditional. Palmyra exposes this hierarchy of memory. Its ruins were mourned loudly, while others disappeared quietly. The lesson is not that Palmyra mattered too much, but that many other places mattered too little in the eyes of the world. Still, Palmyra retains a unique power. Even in fragments, its scale overwhelms. Columns still rise. Shadows still stretch across the desert floor. The city refuses to vanish completely, as if insisting on being seen, not as a finished tragedy, but as an unresolved question. What responsibility does the present have toward the past, when the past cannot defend itself? Perhaps the most honest response to Palmyra is not certainty, but humility. To acknowledge that no solution will restore what was lost. That reconstruction and preservation both carry moral risk. That heritage is not only about saving objects, but about confronting why they are endangered in the first place. Without addressing the conditions that allow destruction, ideology, neglect, inequality, indifference, rebuilding becomes cosmetic. Palmyra's legacy, then, may lie not in stone, but in conscience. The city challenges the assumption that history is durable, simply because it has survived before. Survival in the past does not guarantee survival in the future. Each generation inherits the ruins of those before it, along with the choice of how carefully to hold them. In the silence of the desert, Palmyra waits not for restoration alone, but for recognition of its true meaning. Not as a trophy of antiquity, nor as a victim frozen in time, but as evidence that civilization is fragile, Memory is vulnerable, and responsibility cannot be deferred without consequence. As time moves forward, the question surrounding Palmyra quietly shifts again. The urgency of headlines fades, the rubble settles, and attention drifts elsewhere. What remains is a slower, more unsettling problem: how memory decays when vigilance weakens. Destruction is loud, but forgetting is silent, and silence has a way of finishing what violence began. In the absence of reconstruction or consensus, Palmyra occupies an in-between state, neither fully restored nor fully abandoned. This limbo mirrors a broader uncertainty about how modern societies value the past, once it no longer commands immediate outrage. The danger is not only physical neglect, but conceptual erosion. When a site becomes defined primarily by its destruction, its deeper history risks being reduced to a single moment of loss. Palmyra was more than its final catastrophe, yet that catastrophe threatens to eclipse everything that came before it. This narrowing of memory alters how history is taught, shared, and understood. Palmyra becomes shorthand, a symbol of what extremists destroy, rather than a complex civilization that once solved problems of coexistence, governance, and cultural synthesis. In this reduction, something crucial disappears. The city's long success at negotiating difference, at blending belief systems and architectural traditions, becomes secondary to its failure to survive modern violence. Loss replaces legacy. Yet Palmyra's deeper story resists simplification. For centuries, the city thrived precisely because it existed between worlds. It did not demand purity. It did not erase its contradiction. Its temples, inscriptions, and urban planning reflected a society comfortable with multiplicity. This tolerance was not idealistic, it was practical. Survival in the desert required cooperation, adaptation, and openness to external influence. In this sense, Palmyra offers lessons that extend far beyond archaeology. The irony is sharp. A city built on cultural negotiation was destroyed in the name of ideological absolutes. Where Palmyra once absorbed difference, it was later targeted for representing it. This contrast reveals a deeper conflict that runs through history: the tension between pluralism and control. Architecture made that tension visible. Columns and temples stood as proof that civilizations do not need uniformity to endure. For those who seek domination through erasure, such proof is intolerable. In the long view, Palmyra's destruction is less an anomaly than a symptom. Cultural heritage has always been vulnerable during periods of upheaval. What has changed is the speed and visibility of erasure. Modern tools allow destruction to be recorded, distributed, and instrumentalized as spectacle. The ruins are not only broken, they are performed. This performance transforms violence into messaging, turning architecture into a hostage in a global conversation about power and fear. Against this backdrop, preservation alone is insufficient. Saving stones without safeguarding meaning risks hollow victory. Digital archives, replicas, and models may preserve form, but they cannot preserve context unless accompanied by sustained education and engagement. Palmyra's story must be told in full, not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a continuous human struggle over memory, identity, and authority. Education becomes a form of protection. When people understand what Palmyra represented, not only architecturally, but socially and politically, its loss becomes harder to dismiss. Knowledge restores depth to ruins, allowing them to speak again even when physically damaged. In this way, storytelling becomes an act of resistance against forgetting. Palmyra also forces a reconsideration of responsibility across borders. If heritage truly belongs to humanity, then humanity must accept shared accountability for its survival. This responsibility cannot be activated only when destruction becomes visible or emotionally resonant. It must exist beforehand, embedded in policy, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Otherwise, concern arrives too late, as it did in the desert. Still, there is something enduring in Palmyra's silence. The city does not plead. It does not explain itself. It simply remains fractured, exposed, unresolved. In that unresolved state, it confronts the modern world with a choice: to treat history as expendable once it becomes inconvenient, or to recognize that the past is not finished with us, no matter how deeply it is buried. Palmyra's columns may never stand as they once did. Its temples may remain incomplete. But incompleteness is not the same as erasure. The city's power now lies in its ability to unsettle certainty, to remind us that civilization is not measured by permanence, but by care. What survives is not always what is strongest, but what is protected. And so Palmyra endures not as a triumph, not as a relic, but as a question left deliberately unanswered. A question that each generation must face anew, when history stands defenseless before us. What will we choose to do? Beyond Palmyra itself, the consequences of its destruction ripple outward, touching disciplines and debates that extend far beyond archaeology. The city has become a reference point cited in classrooms, policy papers, and ethical discussions as a case study in what happens when cultural heritage collides with modern conflict. Yet even as Palmyra is invoked repeatedly, there is a risk that repetition dulls urgency. Tragedy, when cited too often, can harden into abstraction. One of the most profound shifts, triggered by Palmyra, concerns how heritage professionals understand risk. For decades, preservation focused on slow threats: erosion, pollution, tourism, neglect. These dangers could be measured, mitigated, planned for. Palmyra revealed a different reality, one in which destruction is sudden, intentional, and symbolic. No conservation treatment can protect a temple from ideology. No management plan can negotiate with fanaticism. This realization forced a painful reassessment of what protection truly means. In response, new strategies emerged. Heritage organizations began collaborating more closely with security analysts, conflict researchers, and digital archivists. Documentation accelerated. Sites were scanned, photographed, and mapped with unprecedented speed, not as leisurely academic exercises, but as emergency measures. This shift carried its own moral tension. Recording a site in anticipation of its possible destruction feels uncomfortably close to accepting loss as inevitable. Yet refusing to document risks, leaving nothing behind at all. Palmyra thus occupies a paradoxical role. It is both a failure and a catalyst. A failure of international systems to prevent destruction, and a catalyst for rethinking how cultural memory is safeguarded. The city exposed the limits of moral outrage, unaccompanied by structural action. Condemnation alone did not save Palmyra. Neither did admiration. What was missing was foresight, the willingness to treat heritage as strategically vulnerable long before it became a target. This vulnerability raises uncomfortable questions about hierarchy. Why are some sites deemed worth extraordinary effort, while others receive minimal attention? Why does recognition often arrive only after destruction has occurred? Palmyra's fame ensured that its loss was mourned globally. Yet countless lesser-known sites vanished without record. The implication is unsettling, that heritage value is often assigned retroactively, once it is too late to protect. The issue is not limited to conflict zones. Palmyra's story resonates wherever history confronts modern priorities. Urban expansion, economic pressure, political ideology, all can endanger heritage through quieter means. Demolition for development may lack the spectacle of explosives, but the outcome can be similar. Palmyra reminds us that erasure does not always announce itself as violence. Sometimes it arrives under the banner of progress. In this broader context, Palmyra becomes less an exception than an extreme example. It illustrates what happens when cultural memory is consistently treated as secondary to immediate interests. War merely accelerates a process already underway. When societies fail to integrate heritage into contemporary life education, identity, policy, it becomes expendable. Stones fall not only because they are attacked, but because they are unguarded. Yet there is also resilience in Palmyra's legacy. Despite destruction, the city continues to generate dialogue, scholarship, and reflection. Its ruins have sparked collaborations across borders and disciplines, uniting historians, technologists, artists, and local voices in attempts to reimagine stewardship. This does not undo loss, but it prevents silence. Silence is the true endpoint of destruction. Perhaps the most enduring contribution Palmyra now offers is perspective. It forces modern societies to confront a difficult truth, that the past is not protected by age alone. Survival is not a reward for endurance. Each era must choose, again and again, whether history is worth defending, not only when it is threatened, but when it is merely inconvenient. In the desert, Palmyra still stands in fragments, bearing witness without spectacle. Its broken columns no longer announce power or prosperity. Instead, they testify to fragility not just of stone, but of human commitment to memory. That testimony is quiet, but it is relentless. And so the story continues, not toward closure, but toward responsibility. Palmyra does not ask to be mourned endlessly. It asks to be understood fully. Understanding, unlike outrage, does not fade quickly. It lingers, shaping choices long after the dust has settled. Beyond Palmyra itself, the consequences of its destruction ripple outward, touching disciplines and debates that extend far beyond archaeology. The city has become a reference point cited in classrooms, policy papers, and ethical discussions as a case study in what happens when cultural heritage collides with modern conflict. Yet even as Palmyra is invoked repeatedly, there is a risk that repetition dulls urgency. Tragedy, when cited too often, can harden into abstraction. One of the most profound shifts triggered by Palmyra concerns how heritage professionals understand risk. For decades, preservation focused on slow threats: erosion, pollution, tourism, neglect. These dangers could be measured, mitigated, planned for. Palmyra revealed a different reality, one in which destruction is sudden, intentional, and symbolic. No conservation treatment can protect a temple from ideology. No management plan can negotiate with fanaticism. This realization forced a painful reassessment of what protection truly means. In response, new strategies emerged. Heritage organizations began collaborating more closely with security analysts, conflict researchers, and digital archivists. Documentation accelerated. Sites were scanned, photographed, and mapped with unprecedented speed, not as leisurely academic exercises, but as emergency measures. This shift carried its own moral tension. Recording a site in anticipation of its possible destruction feels uncomfortably close to accepting loss as inevitable. Yet refusing to document risks, leaving nothing behind at all. Palmyra thus occupies a paradoxical role. It is both a failure and a catalyst. A failure of international systems to prevent destruction, and a catalyst for rethinking how cultural memory is safeguarded. the city exposed the limits of moral outrage, unaccompanied by structural action. Condemnation alone did not save Palmyra. Neither did admiration. What was missing was foresight, the willingness to treat heritage as strategically vulnerable long before it became a target. This vulnerability raises uncomfortable questions about hierarchy. Why are some sites deemed worth extraordinary effort while others receive minimal attention? Why does recognition often arrive only after destruction has occurred? Palmyra's fame ensured that its loss was mourned globally. Yet countless lesser-known sites vanished without record. The implication is unsettling, that heritage value is often assigned retroactively, once it is too late to protect. The issue is not limited to conflict zones. Palmyra's story resonates wherever history confronts modern priorities. Urban expansion, economic pressure, political ideology, all can endanger heritage through quieter means. Demolition for development may lack the spectacle of explosives, but the outcome can be similar. Palmyra reminds us that erasure does not always announce itself as violence. Sometimes it arrives under the banner of progress. In this broader context, Palmyra becomes less an exception than an extreme example. It illustrates what happens when cultural memory is consistently treated as secondary to immediate interests. War merely accelerates a process already underway. When societies fail to integrate heritage into contemporary life education, identity, policy, it becomes expendable. Stones fall not only because they are attacked, but because they are unguarded. Yet there is also resilience in Palmyra's legacy. Despite destruction, the city continues to generate dialogue, scholarship, and reflection. Its ruins have sparked collaborations across borders and disciplines, uniting historians, technologists, artists, and local voices in attempts to reimagine stewardship. This does not undo loss, but it prevents silence. Silence is the true endpoint of destruction. Perhaps the most enduring contribution Palmyra now offers is perspective. It forces modern societies to confront a difficult truth, that the past is not protected by age alone. Survival is not a reward for endurance. Each era must choose, again and again, whether history is worth defending not only when it is threatened, but when it is merely inconvenient. In the desert, Palmyra still stands in fragments, bearing witness without spectacle. Its broken columns no longer announce power or prosperity. Instead, they testify to fragility not just of stone, but of human commitment to memory. That testimony is quiet, but it is relentless. And so the story continues, not toward closure, but toward responsibility. Palmyra does not ask to be mourned endlessly. It asks to be understood fully. Understanding, unlike outrage, does not fade quickly. It lingers, shaping choices long after the dust has settled.